I paid $58,000 for my daughter's wedding. Every penny I had saved for retirement. I thought I was buying her happiness, maybe even securing my place in her life. Then 3 days before the ceremony, she called me and said, "Dad, don't come to the rehearsal dinner." No explanation, no argument, just distance. And in that moment, I realized the wedding I funded might be the day I lost my daughter. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube. I used to measure my life in overtime hours and double shifts. That's how I kept track of time. Not birthdays, not anniversaries, overtime. Because overtime was how I built a life for my little girl. Her name is Emily, and from the day she wrapped her tiny hand around my finger in that hospital room, I made a promise I never said out loud. I will never let you feel alone in this world. Her mother and I divorced when Emily was 9. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just quiet disappointment that stretched too far. After the divorce, Emily stayed mostly with her mom, and I got every other weekend, Wednesday dinners, and half the holidays. It never felt like enough. I remember sitting in my truck outside her mother's house on Sunday nights, watching the porch light glow while I tried to stretch those last few minutes before walking her to the door. She'd always hug me tight and whisper, "Love you, Daddy." That's what kept me going. I worked construction for 27 years. It's honest work, but it takes its toll. My knees ache when it rains, my back stiffens in the cold, but I never complained because every scraped knuckle and sore muscle meant Emily had dance lessons or a new laptop for school or braces when her teeth came in crooked. I didn't just pay child support, I paid attention. I showed up to recitals, science fairs, and choir concerts. Even when her mother remarried and her stepfather started sitting in the front row too. His name is Richard. He's polite, always has been. Corporate type, button-down shirts even at barbecues. He and Emily got close over the years. I won't lie, it stung sometimes, watching another man teach her to drive because I had to work late, seeing him in photos from school events I couldn't attend. But I swallowed that jealousy. Because loving your child means accepting that the world will love them too. When Emily met Jason, she was 26. She called me after their third date. "Dad, I think he's the one." I smiled into the phone like she could see me. Jason worked in finance, confident, well-spoken, ambitious. The first time I met him, he shook my hand firmly and said, "Sir, I've heard a lot about you." I couldn't tell if that was a compliment or a warning. They got engaged after a year. It happened on a beach in Florida. There were professional photos, a drone video, champagne and crystal flutes. It was beautiful. Emily sent me the video and I watched it 3 times in a row. I won't pretend I didn't feel something else beneath the pride, a quiet awareness that she was stepping into a world that didn't quite look like mine. The wedding planning started almost immediately. Emily called one evening, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Dad, we found the perfect venue." It was a restored historic estate an hour outside the city. Chandeliers, manicured gardens, white marble floors. I looked it up online after we hung up. It was stunning. It was also expensive. A week later, she came over for dinner. I grilled steaks, her favorite. We sat at my small kitchen table, the same one she did homework at as a kid. She seemed nervous. Jason sat beside her, arm draped around her chair. "Dad," she began carefully, "we've been going over the numbers." I nodded. I already knew where this was heading. "The wedding is going to cost around $80,000, she said quickly, like ripping off a bandage. I whistled low. That was more than I made in a year some years. "We're paying for most of it," Jason added smoothly, "but traditionally, the bride's father contributes." Traditionally. That word hung in the air. I had savings, not $80,000, but enough to be comfortable if I retired at 65. I was 62. $58,000 sat in an account labeled retirement. Decades of concrete dust and sunburned summers. Emily looked at me with those same brown eyes she had at 9 years old. "I don't expect you to cover all of it," she said softly. "Just what you can." What I can. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click with every rotation. I thought about birthdays I missed because of work, about the time she cried when I couldn't afford the class trip in middle school, about every moment I wished I could give her more. The next morning, I went to the bank. I transferred $58,000 into her wedding account. All of it. I told myself I didn't need much to retire. I'd figure it out. Maybe work a few extra years, maybe downsize. What mattered was that when Emily walked down that aisle, she would feel supported, chosen, loved. When I told her, she burst into tears. "Dad, that's too much." "It's exactly enough," I said. "You deserve the best day of your life." She hugged me so tight I could feel her heartbeat against my chest. In that moment, I felt rich. But something shifted after the money was transferred. Slowly, subtly. Jason started making more decisions. The guest list changed. Some of my relatives were moved to a secondary table due to space. The father-daughter dance song Emily and I had joked about for years was replaced with something more elegant. I brushed it off. Weddings are stressful. Emotions run high. Then 3 days before the wedding, my phone rang. Emily's name lit up the screen. I answered with a smile in my voice. "Hey, sweetheart. Ready for the big weekend?" There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Dad," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something." My chest tightened. "Jason and I were talking, and we think it might be better if you don't come to the rehearsal dinner." I laughed at first. I thought she was joking. "I'm serious," she said quickly. "It's just going to be immediate family and the wedding party. We don't want it to feel complicated." Complicated. I gripped the phone harder. "I'm your father, Emily." "I know," she whispered. "But Richard's been helping a lot with the coordination, and Jason's parents are hosting. It's just easier this way." Easier. In that moment, I understood something I had been refusing to see. I wasn't being uninvited because of space. I was being uninvited because I no longer fit neatly into the picture. I swallowed hard. "If that's what you want." "It is," she said, too quickly. We hung up. I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the same wood grain where she once practiced spelling words. $58,000, 27 years of overtime. And now, I wasn't welcome at the dinner where families officially come together. That night, I didn't feel rich anymore. I felt replaced. I didn't tell anyone about that phone call. Not my sister. Not my coworkers, not even the one friend I sometimes have coffee with on Sundays. There's a particular kind of humiliation that comes with being excluded from your own child's life, and it doesn't beg for witnesses. It begs for silence. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for Friday evening at a private room in an upscale restaurant downtown. I knew because I'd helped review the contract weeks earlier. I had nodded and said it looked reasonable. At the time, I assumed I would be there, sitting at one of those long candlelit tables, listening to speeches about love and family. Friday came heavy and gray. The sky looked undecided, like it couldn't commit to rain. I woke up early out of habit and made coffee I barely drank. My house felt different that morning, too quiet. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting Emily to call back and say she'd changed her mind. She didn't. Around 4 in the afternoon, I caught myself calculating what time they would be arriving at the restaurant. 5:30 for cocktails, 6 for dinner. I imagined Emily in a soft white dress, laughing nervously, holding a glass of wine. I imagined Richard standing near her, hand on her shoulder, smiling like a man fulfilling a duty. I told myself not to be bitter. Richard had been present. He had driven her to practice when I couldn't. He had paid for things, too. But I couldn't ignore the fact that I just drained my retirement to make this wedding possible, and somehow that didn't qualify me as immediate family. At 6:15, I did something I'm not proud of. I drove downtown. I didn't plan to go inside. I just needed to see it with my own eyes. The restaurant was all glass and warm lighting, the kind of place where valet attendants wear pressed jackets. I parked across the street and sat in my truck. Through the windows, I could see a long table dressed in ivory linens. There were floral centerpieces, white roses and eucalyptus if I wasn't mistaken. Emily always loved simple flowers. I recognized Jason's parents immediately. His father stood near the head of the table, gesturing confidently as he spoke to a small group. And then I saw her, my daughter. She looked radiant, not just beautiful, but glowing with that particular joy brides have when everything feels like it's finally happening. She laughed at something someone said and leaned into Richard's side. He kissed her temple gently. It was a small, tender moment, the kind that might not mean much to anyone else, but to me, it felt like a door closing. I waited, watching for a sign of hesitation on her face, a glance toward the entrance, a flicker of doubt, something that suggested she missed me. Instead, she seemed comfortable. At one point, Jason stood and tapped his glass with a fork. The room quieted. I couldn't hear his words through the glass, but I could see his expression, confident, controlled. He raised his glass toward his parents first, then toward Richard and Emily's mother. They clinked glasses. Applause followed. I wasn't there to toast my daughter. I wasn't there to stand up and embarrass her with a sentimental speech about how she used to insist on wearing rain boots in the summer. I was a shadow across the street. After about 20 minutes, I drove away. My chest felt tight, not from anger, but from something heavier, displacement, like I had stepped outside my own life and someone else had taken my seat. That night, Emily texted me, "Dinner went well, busy tomorrow, love you." Just that. I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "Love you too, proud of you." I meant it. Even through the hurt, I meant it. The next morning was the wedding day. I had been given a role, walk her halfway down the aisle, then hand her off to Richard for the remainder. It had been presented as a modern, thoughtful, inclusive symbol. Now it felt like choreography designed to ease me out gently. I put on my suit slowly. It was charcoal gray, tailored years ago for a company banquet. I checked myself in the mirror and saw a man who looked older than 62. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper. I wondered if Emily would notice. When I arrived at the estate, the atmosphere was breathtaking. Sunlight poured over the gardens, illuminating rows of white chairs arranged perfectly on the lawn. Guests mingled, champagne flutes in hand. I recognized distant relatives and nodded politely. Some approached me with warm smiles. They said, "You must be so proud." I answered, "Yes, I am," each time. Inside, the bridal suite buzzed with energy. I knocked softly before entering. Emily stood near the mirror in her gown. It was elegant and timeless, lace sleeves and a long flowing train. For a moment, all the resentment dissolved. She turned and saw me. Her eyes softened. "Dad." I opened my arms, and she stepped into them carefully, mindful of the dress. "You look beautiful," I whispered. "Thank you for everything," she said against my shoulder. "I know this has been a lot. A lot." I pulled back slightly. "I just want you happy." She nodded, but something unreadable flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe? Or nerves? Before I could say more, Jason entered the room. He smiled tightly. "Ready for the big moment?" Emily's hand slipped from mine as she turned toward him, and in that subtle shift, I felt it again. The quiet realization that I was no longer the center of her world. Maybe I never should have been expected to be. That's the natural order of things, I suppose. But I hadn't expected to feel erased. As the music began outside and guests took their seats, a coordinator signaled it was time. Richard stood waiting near the aisle entrance. He gave me a courteous nod. "Shall we?" he said. We positioned ourselves according to the plan. I would walk her halfway, he would finish. Emily took a deep breath and placed her arm through mine. The doors opened, and as we stepped forward into the sunlight, I told myself that whatever happened next, I would not let my pain overshadow her day, even if I was already grieving something no one else seemed to notice. The music swelled as we stepped onto the white aisle runner, and for a moment the world narrowed to the sound of her breathing and the gentle pressure of her hand on my arm. Guests stood in unison, faces turned toward us, cameras lifted. I kept my eyes forward, afraid that if I looked at the crowd, I might see confirmation of what I was already feeling, that I was playing a role in a production that no longer truly belonged to me. Emily's grip tightened slightly as we walked. "You okay?" she whispered without turning her head. "I'm fine," I murmured back, and I meant that in the most complicated way possible. Halfway down the aisle, there was a subtle pause in the music, just enough for the choreography to unfold. Richard stepped forward, smiling warmly, hand extended. The crowd didn't know the emotional math happening in that space between us. To them, it was symbolic unity. To me, it was a passing of something that had already been slipping away. Emily released my arm and placed her hand in his. The shift was small, barely noticeable, but my body felt the absence immediately. I stepped aside as Richard continued walking her toward Jason, who waited beneath a floral arch at the front. The applause rose softly, like a tide coming in. I moved to my seat in the front row, alone. Her mother sat on the other side of the aisle. Jason's parents filled the remaining seats nearby. From where I sat, I could see Emily's face clearly as the ceremony began. She looked radiant, eyes shining, voice steady as she spoke her vows. Jason's words were polished and confident, promising partnership and ambition and shared dreams. I listened carefully, searching for something personal, something that hinted at the girl who once built pillow forts in my living room. When it came time for the officiant to acknowledge the families, he thanked both sets of parents for their unwavering support. He named Jason's parents first, then Emily's mother and Richard. There was a brief, almost awkward pause before he added, and of course, Emily's father, whose generosity helped make this beautiful day possible. Generosity. The word landed like a receipt being handed back to me. The ceremony ended with cheers and applause. They kissed, cameras flashed, guests began moving toward the cocktail area. Several people approached me to shake my hand. "You must be so proud," they repeated. "I am," I said again, and again it was true. Pride and pain can occupy the same space. I was learning that in real time. During the reception, I was seated at a table labeled Bride's Family, but most of the conversation revolved around people I didn't know well, Jason's colleagues, distant relatives from his side. They spoke about investment portfolios and destination honeymoons. I nodded politely, sipping water, feeling like a guest at someone else's celebration. The father-daughter dance came sooner than I expected. I had assumed we would dance to the song Emily and I used to joke about, an old Motown classic we'd sing loudly in the car when she was a teenager. But when the DJ announced it, a slow orchestral piece began to play. Elegant, controlled. Emily approached me with a soft smile. "Ready?" I stood and took her hand. The spotlight followed us to the center of the dance floor. As we began to sway, I leaned closer. "This isn't the song we talked about." She looked up at me, eyes flickering with something like apology. "Jason thought this one felt more timeless." Timeless. I nodded slowly. "It's beautiful." We moved in small circles. Her dress brushed against my shoes. I remembered holding her when she was small enough to fit entirely against my chest. I remembered teaching her how to ride a bike, running behind her down our cracked sidewalk. I remember the first time she cried over a boy who didn't call her back. "I'm sorry about the rehearsal dinner," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the music. I swallowed. "It's okay. It just felt easier," she continued. "There were so many personalities. I didn't want tension." "Tension from who?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "Jason felt like things should start fresh, without old dynamics." "Old dynamics." I let that settle. "Am I an old dynamic?" Her eyes glistened. "No, you're my dad." The music slowed further, nearing its end. "But I'm not the only one anymore," I said quietly, not accusing, just stating what we both knew. She didn't respond. Instead, she rested her head briefly against my chest. For a second, I allowed myself to believe we were still exactly who we used to be. When the song ended, applause filled the room. She stepped back, smiling for the cameras. Then she turned and walked straight into Jason's arms. Later in the evening, speeches began. Jason's father spoke first, delivering a polished toast about partnership and legacy. Emily's mother followed, her voice warm and emotional. Then Richard stood. He spoke about watching Emily grow into the woman she had become, about helping with college applications and late-night homework sessions, about being honored to walk her down the aisle. The crowd clapped warmly. I hadn't been scheduled to speak. I found that out when the DJ moved on without calling my name. For a brief second, I considered standing up anyway, telling a story, claiming space, but I stayed seated. Because love, I was beginning to understand, doesn't always demand recognition. As the night wore on and the dance floor filled, I stepped outside onto the terrace. The air was cool, the estate lights glowed softly against the dark sky. I leaned against the railing and let the quiet wrap around me. $58,000. Not for the flowers, not for the venue, for this moment. For her happiness. And despite everything, the rehearsal dinner, the aisle choreography, the speeches, I could see she was happy. The question was no longer whether I had been replaced. The question was whether I could learn to love her without needing to be centered in her life. Behind me, laughter spilled through the open doors. I stood there alone, realizing that sometimes being a father means stepping back so far you almost disappear, and trusting that your love still counts. I left the reception earlier than most people noticed. I made my rounds first, hugged a few relatives, shook Jason's hand. He thanked me again for everything. The way he said it was polite, composed, like acknowledging a vendor who had delivered on time. Emily hugged me tightly before I walked out. "I'll call you before we leave for the honeymoon," she promised. "I'll be here," I said. The drive home felt longer than usual. The roads were dark and mostly empty, streetlights stretching ahead like quiet witnesses. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for a while, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. My house looked the same, small, modest, paid off after years of careful budgeting. I unlocked the door and stepped into the silence. No music, no laughter, no white dresses, just the hum of the refrigerator. I loosened my tie and set my suit jacket over the back of a chair. On the wall in the hallway, there's a row of framed photographs. Emily at 5 in a Halloween costume, Emily at 12 with missing front teeth, Emily at 17 holding her high school diploma while I stood beside her, beaming. I paused in front of those photos and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Grief. Not for the wedding, not even for the rehearsal dinner, for the chapter that had officially closed. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight spilling through the blinds and a dull ache behind my eyes. My phone was silent. I made coffee and tried to keep myself busy. I mowed the lawn, fixed a loose cabinet hinge, anything to avoid sitting still with my thoughts. Around noon, my sister called. "How was it?" she asked gently. "Beautiful," I said. "Everything she wanted." She hesitated. "And you?" I forced a chuckle. "I survived." She didn't push. She knows me too well. Later that afternoon, Emily texted a photo from the airport. She and Jason were smiling, boarding passes in hand. "On our way to Italy," the caption read. I replied with a thumbs up and a heart. Then I set my phone down and stared at the ceiling again. The house felt larger without the anticipation of wedding planning. For months, my weekends had been filled with tastings and venue visits and vendor meetings. I had felt needed, involved. Now there was nothing on the calendar. That week, I went back to work as if nothing had changed. The guys on the site asked for pictures. I showed them a few on my phone. They whistled at the venue. "Must have cost a fortune," one of them joked. I smiled faintly. Something like that. On Friday evening, I stopped by the bank to review my accounts. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to face the reality of what I'd done. The balance in my retirement fund was nearly empty, just a small remainder I had left behind without thinking. The number didn't scare me the way it probably should have. What unsettled me was the quiet realization that I had equated money with permanence. I had believed that if I gave enough, I would remain central. But love doesn't work like a transaction, and children don't stay children just because we pay their bills. 2 weeks passed before Emily called. "Dad, we're back." Her voice was bright, sun-kissed. "How was Italy?" I asked. "Incredible. The food, the views. Jason's parents are thinking of buying a place there someday." Jason's parents. I listened as she described vineyards and boat rides and late-night dinners overlooking the water. I was happy for her, truly. Then there was a pause. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked softly. "Of course," I said. "Why wouldn't I be?" "I don't know. You've seemed distant." The irony almost made me laugh. "I'm just giving you space. You're married now. You've got your own life." She was quiet for a moment. "You'll always be part of it." I wanted to believe that. But a small voice inside me asked, "In what capacity?" A week later, she invited me over for dinner at their new condo. It was sleek and modern, high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place that smells faintly of new paint and ambition. Jason greeted me at the door, friendly but measured. We sat at a glass dining table that felt too delicate for my calloused hands. During dinner, conversation stayed light. Work updates, travel plans, future goals. Then Jason mentioned something that made my fork pause midair. "We're thinking about investing in a larger property next year," he said casually, "something with more long-term value." "That's great," I said. He nodded. "It helps having support from family." Emily glanced at him quickly. A silent exchange passed between them. I set my fork down slowly. "What kind of support?" Jason leaned back slightly. "Just guidance, connections, financial strategy. Not money, exactly, but the implication hung there." For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly. The wedding hadn't just been about celebration. It had been about positioning, about influence, about who stood where in the hierarchy of their new life. And suddenly, the rehearsal dinner made more sense. It wasn't about space. It was about control. I looked at my daughter across that polished table and wondered if she even realized it, or if she had simply stepped into a world where I no longer spoke the language fluently. As I drove home that night, a thought settled in my mind with quiet certainty. Maybe the real test of fatherhood isn't how much you give. Maybe it's knowing when to stop giving in ways that diminish you. And I wasn't sure yet whether I had passed that test. After that dinner, something inside me shifted, not in a loud, dramatic way. There was no confrontation, no slammed doors, just a quiet recalibration. For most of my life, I had defined myself by what I could provide. If Emily needed something, I found a way. If she dreamed it, I tried to build it. That had been my language of love. But sitting at that glass dining table, listening to Jason talk about long-term value and family support, I realized I had unintentionally taught her something too, that my role was to fund the foundation. The following Sunday, I didn't call her like I usually did. I waited. Mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed. "Everything okay?" Emily texted. "Yes," I replied, "just busy." That wasn't entirely true. I wasn't busy. I was learning how to sit still without reaching for my wallet or my calendar. A few days later, she called. "Dad, you've been quiet," she said. "I've been thinking," I answered, honestly. "About what?" "About retirement. About slowing down." There was a pause. "That's good, isn't it?" "I suppose it should be." I didn't mention that retirement now looked different than it had 6 months ago, that instead of comfort, it meant recalculating, downsizing, maybe taking on consulting work. I didn't want her to feel guilty, and truthfully, I wasn't sure guilt would change anything. 2 months passed. Summer shifted into early fall. Leaves began turning the same shade of amber as Emily's hair when she was a child. Then one evening, she showed up at my door unannounced. I opened it to find her standing there alone, no Jason beside her. She looked tired, not physically, emotionally. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. "Of course." She walked into the living room and sat on the couch, glancing around as if she hadn't been there in years. Maybe she hadn't, not really. "I need to ask you something," she said. I sat across from her. "Okay." She folded her hands together. "Jason and I are considering putting a down payment on a larger place. The market's moving fast." I stayed quiet. "We were wondering if you'd be willing to help. Just a short-term loan. We'd pay you back." There it was, not subtle this time. I took a slow breath. "How much?" She named a number that made my chest tighten. It wasn't 58,000, but it was significant. "Emily," I said gently, "I gave you everything I had for the wedding." Her eyes widened slightly. "I know, and I'm so grateful. This would just be temporary." "I'm not sure I have temporary to give." Silence filled the room. "Jason's parents are contributing too. We just thought that I would too." She looked down. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Why didn't you want me at the rehearsal dinner?" Her head snapped up, startled. "Dad." "No anger," I said softly. "I just want honesty." She swallowed. "Jason felt like you were too involved, that the wedding started feeling like it was more about proving something." "Proving what?" "That you could provide, that you were still the main man in my life." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they held a sliver of truth. "I never wanted to compete," I said quietly. "I know," she whispered, "but it felt that way to him, and I didn't want tension before the wedding, so I chose the path of least resistance, which was me." She didn't deny it. A long silence settled between us. "Do you regret it?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Sometimes." That single word carried more weight than a speech ever could. "I watched you from across the street," I admitted before I could stop myself. Her face went pale. "You were there?" "I didn't come in. I just needed to see." Tears slipped down her cheeks now. "Dad, I never wanted to hurt you." "I know. And I don't think Jason understood what that money meant to you. It wasn't about the money, though we both knew it partly was. Not the amount, the sacrifice." She reached for my hand. "I feel pulled sometimes between two worlds." "That's marriage," I replied gently. "But being pulled doesn't mean you let go of one side completely." She cried then, not loudly, just quiet, restrained tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I squeezed her hand. "I forgave you the night of the wedding." She looked up, surprised. "I had to," I continued, "because if I didn't, I would start giving with conditions, and that's not love." She nodded slowly. "But," I added carefully, "for the first time in my life, I need to set one condition." She stiffened slightly. "What kind of condition?" "I won't fund your future anymore, not because I don't love you, but because I need to love myself enough to protect what I have left." The words felt strange but steady as they left my mouth. She absorbed them quietly. "I don't want you to see me as a bank. I want you to see me as your father." "I do," she said quickly. "Then let me be that, not an investor, not leverage." She wiped her face and nodded. "I understand." And for the first time since the rehearsal dinner phone call, I felt something real shift between us. Not distance, not replacement. Respect. When she stood to leave, she hugged me longer than usual. "I don't want to lose you," she murmured. "You won't," I said, "but we're both going to have to grow up a little." After she drove away, I sat back down on the couch and let the quiet settle again. This time, it didn't feel like grief. It felt like boundary. And sometimes, boundary is the purest form of love. After that conversation, things were different between us. Not colder, not distant, just clearer. Emily didn't bring up the down payment again. A few weeks later, she mentioned casually that Jason's parents had decided to help them secure a smaller place instead of the larger property they initially wanted. She said it lightly, as if it had always been the plan. I didn't challenge it. Some lessons don't need commentary. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt. For years, I had carried an invisible weight, the belief that my value in my daughter's life was directly tied to what I could provide. Now that I had stepped away from that role, I expected to feel diminished. Instead, I felt steadier. Emily started calling more often. Not about money, not about logistics, just to talk. One evening, she called while I was sitting on my back porch watching the sun dip behind the trees. "Dad, do you remember when you taught me how to ride a bike?" she asked out of nowhere. I smiled. "You ran into Mrs. Carter's mailbox." "You let me think it was my fault for years," she laughed. "It was your fault." She giggled, and for a moment she sounded like she was 14 again. Then her tone shifted slightly. "Jason and I had a disagreement. I didn't jump in with advice, I just listened. He thinks I lean on you too much emotionally," she said quietly, "that I compare him to you sometimes." I took a slow breath. "Do you?" She hesitated. "Maybe." There it was again, that quiet honesty. "Emily," I said gently, "a husband isn't supposed to replace a father. He's supposed to be something different." "I know," she replied, "but sometimes I feel like I'm still trying to prove I made the right choice." "To who?" "Everyone." The word hung between us. "I didn't pay for your wedding so you'd feel indebted to your choice," I said carefully. "I paid because I love you." "I know that now," she whispered. A few days later, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. I can't remember the last time anyone sent me one of those. It was from Emily. She wrote about the rehearsal dinner, about how she had felt pressure from multiple directions. Jason wanting to establish boundaries, his parents wanting a more traditional structure, her mother trying to keep peace, and in the middle of it all, she had chosen what felt easiest. "You've always been the one who would understand," she wrote, "so I expected you to absorb the hurt quietly." That line stayed with me. She hadn't excluded me because I mattered least. She had excluded me because she believed I would love her through it. That didn't erase the pain, but it reframed it. At the bottom of the letter, she added, "I don't want you to disappear from my life just because I'm building a new one." Disappear. That word echoed what I had felt on the terrace that night. I called her after reading it. "I'm not going anywhere," I said when she answered. "I don't want you to stand so far back that I can't see you." We were both learning that love requires adjustment, not surrender. A month later, they invited me over again. This time, the atmosphere felt different, less formal. Jason greeted me with a genuine smile. During dinner, Jason brought up the wedding. "You owe me an apology," he said directly, meeting my eyes. I stayed quiet. "I felt threatened," he admitted, "not by you as a person, but by what you represented. Stability, history, authority. I wanted to establish my own place, and pushing me out felt like control," I said calmly. "Yes." He nodded. There was no defensiveness in his tone, just acknowledgement. "I didn't realize how much that dinner meant," I replied. "It wasn't about the dinner. It was about belonging." He absorbed that. "I want you to belong," he said sincerely. "Not as a financer, as family." The simplicity of that sentence eased something I hadn't realized was still tight inside me. After dinner, Emily insisted we all sit and look through the wedding photos. As the images flashed across the screen, I saw things I hadn't noticed that day. The way she glanced toward me during the ceremony, the way her hand lingered in mine during the dance, the way she watched me during the speeches, even when I wasn't speaking. I hadn't been erased. I had just been repositioned. Later that night, as I drove home, I thought about what fatherhood really means. When children are small, love is physical. You carry them, feed them, protect them. When they grow up, love becomes restraint. You step back. You let them choose. You allow them to make mistakes, even those mistakes cut you. And you decide whether your pride is more important than your presence. I won't pretend the hurt disappeared overnight. There are still moments when I replay that phone call in my head. "Dad, "Don't come to the rehearsal dinner." But now, when I hear it, I don't hear rejection. I hear a young woman trying to balance worlds she didn't yet understand. And I see a man who needed to learn that love given freely must also be protected wisely. I didn't lose my daughter that weekend. I lost the illusion that I could secure my place in her life with money. And what I gained instead was something steadier. A relationship not built on sacrifice alone, but on mutual respect. The first holiday after the wedding arrived quicker than I expected. Thanksgiving had always been simple when Emily was growing up. Turkey a little too dry, mashed potatoes with too much butter, football humming in the background while she pretended not to care about it. After the divorce, we alternated years. I learned how to cook for two, then for one. This year, Emily and Jason were hosting. When she invited me, her voice carried a note of careful hope. "We'd really love for you to come, Dad." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. But as the day approached, I felt that old uncertainty creeping back in. Where would I fit? Would I be seated at the edge again? Would every conversation subtly remind me that I was visiting a life that no longer revolved around me? I arrived with a pumpkin pie I baked myself. The crust was slightly uneven, but I knew Emily wouldn't care. She opened the door wearing a soft cream sweater, hair pulled back loosely. She looked relaxed, comfortable. "Dad!" She hugged me immediately, not the polite kind of hug from the wedding day, but the tight, familiar one. Inside, the condo felt warmer than before, less like a showroom, more lived in. Jason was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, basting the turkey. He waved me in. "Glad you're here," he said. It wasn't forced, it wasn't strategic, it felt real. Jason's parents arrived shortly after. His father greeted me with a firm handshake. His mother complimented the pie. We all gathered around the table, dishes overlapping slightly because the space wasn't quite big enough for everything. It struck me that this wasn't the grand aspirational home they once discussed. It was modest, sensible. During dinner, conversation flowed easily. Travel plans, work updates. At one point, Jason's father began discussing investment opportunities again, the same confident tone he always used. Normally, I would have shrunk into quiet observation. This time, I didn't. "I've been thinking about consulting part-time, construction management. There's good money in oversight work." Jason looked genuinely interested. "That makes sense. You've got decades of experience." "I do," I replied calmly. Not defensive, just factual. Emily glanced at me with a small smile. It wasn't admiration, it wasn't guilt, it was recognition. After dinner, she pulled me aside into the hallway. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I was invited," I teased gently. She rolled her eyes, but then grew serious. "I know things haven't been perfect." "Whose family is?" I replied. She hesitated. "Sometimes I worry you're still hurt." I considered lying, then I chose honesty. I was hurt. She nodded slowly. "But I'm not angry," I continued, "and I'm not keeping score." That seemed to ease something in her shoulders. "I never wanted you to feel replaced," she said. "I know. And you're not." I looked at her carefully. "Then don't treat me like I am." She absorbed that, not defensively, but thoughtfully. Later that evening, as I was putting on my coat, Jason approached me. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Sure." "How did you know when to let go?" The question surprised me. "Let go of what?" I asked. "Of being the main voice in her life." I studied him for a moment. There was no arrogance in his expression now, just uncertainty. "You don't let go all at once," I said. "You loosen your grip a little at a time, and you trust that if you raised her well, she'll still turn back to you when it matters." He nodded slowly. "I didn't understand that before the wedding," he admitted. "I thought I had to claim space." "You don't claim space in a family, you earn it." He took that in quietly. As I drove home that night, I realized something subtle but important. The power dynamic had shifted again. Not because I asserted dominance, not because I demanded apologies, but because I stopped overextending myself to secure approval. There's a difference between generosity and self-erasure. For years, I blurred that line. In giving everything, I unknowingly made it easy to overlook me. When you always absorb the tension, people forget it costs you something. A few weeks later, Emily called with unexpected news. "I got a promotion," she said breathlessly. "It's a leadership role." "That's incredible," I said, pride swelling naturally this time, untainted by obligation. "They offered me the position after that big presentation last month, the one you helped me prepare for." I smiled. "You didn't need much help." "You needed my perspective," she corrected gently. That meant more than any public thank you speech ever could. Before we hung up, she added, "We're thinking about hosting Christmas, too. Would you be okay if we split time between families?" "Of course," I said, and I meant it without resentment, because now splitting time didn't feel like splitting loyalty. It felt like adulthood. That night, I sat on my porch again, the air colder now, and reflected on how easily love can become entangled with ego. I had wanted to be central, essential, unquestioned. But being a father isn't about being irreplaceable. It's about being steady. And steadiness doesn't require spotlight. I didn't attend that rehearsal dinner, but I was there for the marriage that followed. And in the end, that mattered more. Winter settled in quietly that year. The air turned sharp and the mornings came slower. I found myself appreciating the stillness more than I used to. There's something about cold weather that forces reflection. You can't rush through it. You move deliberately, thoughtfully. A week before Christmas, Emily called me late in the evening. "Dad," she said, her voice softer than usual, "can you come over tomorrow?" There was something in her tone I recognized immediately. Not panic, not crisis, just vulnerability. "Of course," I said. When I arrived the next afternoon, the condo looked festive but understated. A modest tree stood in the corner, decorated with white lights and simple ornaments. No extravagant displays, no performative elegance, just warmth. Emily was alone when she opened the door. "Where's Jason?" I asked. "He's meeting with a client. I wanted to talk to you first." That caught my attention. We sat on the couch, the tree lights casting a soft glow across the room. She held a mug in both hands, though I noticed she wasn't drinking from it. "I've been thinking a lot about the wedding," she began. I didn't interrupt. "I've been thinking about that phone call, about the dinner, about everything." I waited. "You were so focused on starting my new life that you treated me like you were part of the old one." The honesty in her voice was steady now, mature. "You weren't old," she continued. "You were foundational." That word landed deeper than she probably realized. "I think I confused independence with distance," she said quietly. "I thought stepping fully into marriage meant stepping away from you." "And now?" I asked gently. "Now I see that stepping away from you would mean stepping away from the part of me that feels grounded." There it was. Not guilt, not obligation, understanding. She set the mug down and reached for her purse. From it, she pulled a small envelope. "She wanted to give this to you before Christmas," she said. I opened it slowly. Inside was a check. My breath caught. It wasn't $58,000. It wasn't even close, but it was substantial. "Emily," I started. "Please let me finish," she said softly. "Jason and I talked. We've been saving. This isn't repayment. I know you never asked for that." "Then what is it?" I asked carefully. "It's partnership." The word surprised me. "You invested in my beginning, not because you expected returns, but because you believed in me. I don't want that to be one-sided forever." I stared at the check for a long moment. The amount represented sacrifice on their end, adjusted plans, delayed upgrades. "You don't owe me," I said quietly. "I know," she replied. "That's why it means something." For a second, I saw the little girl who used to insist on paying me back $1 if she borrowed 50 cents for the school vending machine, not because I demanded it, because she valued balance. "I'm proud of you," I said finally. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't heavy. They were clear. "I was afraid you'd see this as charity," she admitted. "I don't. I see it as respect." We sat in silence for a moment, the tree lights blinking softly. Then she asked the question I think she'd been carrying for months. "Did you ever regret paying for the wedding?" I considered that carefully. "There were moments," I admitted, "moments when I felt foolish or taken for granted." She nodded slowly. "But regret?" I continued. "No, because I didn't give that money to secure my place. I gave it because I loved you." "And you still would?" she asked. "I would," I admitted honestly, "but I'd do it differently." "How?" "I'd make sure I wasn't disappearing in the process." She smiled faintly. "I don't want you to disappear." "I won't," I replied. When Jason returned home later that evening, he greeted me warmly. There was no tension, no unspoken competition. He thanked me again, not for the money this time, but for being patient while they figured things out. "We were both learning," he admitted. "So was I replied. As I prepared to leave, Emily walked me to the door. "Dad?" she said before I stepped out. "Yes?" "If we ever have kids, I want them to know you the way I do." The words hit deeper than anything that night. "Then let's make sure they do," I said softly. Driving home, I felt something settle inside me that hadn't fully settled before. Closure. Not because everything had been perfect, not because mistakes hadn't been made, but because growth had followed. The rehearsal dinner no longer felt like a defining wound. It felt like a turning point, a moment where we all confronted the fragile balance between love and ego, independence and connection. And maybe that's what weddings really are. Not just unions of two people, but transitions for everyone involved. I pulled into my driveway and looked up at the night sky. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful.
Christmas morning came quietly that year. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't rushing to drive somewhere or worrying about missing a call. I woke up slowly, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the faint glow of early sunlight reflect off the frost-covered grass. Later that morning, Emily and Jason arrived together. They brought gifts wrapped neatly with handwritten tags. Emily ran inside first, like she used to when she was little, scanning the room for the tree and smiling at the small stack of presents beneath it. "Dad," she laughed, "you still wrap gifts like a construction worker." "I take pride in efficiency," I replied. Jason shook my hand and handed me a box. From both of us. Inside was something unexpected, a framed photo from the wedding. Not the staged portraits, not the polished shots. It was a candid image, the moment halfway down the aisle. In the photo, Richard stood at the front, and I stood slightly behind. But the camera had captured something I hadn't seen that day. Emily's face as she transitioned from my arm to Richard's. Her eyes were looking back at me, not with rejection, not with detachment, but with gratitude. I stared at that photograph longer than I intended. "We thought it was important," Emily said softly, "that you see what we saw." I cleared my throat. "I know," she said, "but now you get to see it from our perspective." I placed the frame carefully on the mantel that afternoon. We spent the day cooking together. Emily insisted on helping, even though she claimed Jason was dangerous with kitchen knives. There was laughter in the house again, the kind that flows naturally when people feel safe with each other. At one point, while we were preparing dinner, Emily leaned against the counter and looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you feel different now?" she asked. "Different from when?" "From before the wedding." I considered that. "Yes," I answered honestly. "I feel lighter." She tilted her head. "Because you set boundaries?" "Because I stopped trying to control outcomes." She smiled gently. "That sounds like something I need to learn too." I replied, "You already are." Later, after dinner, we gathered around the living room. The conversation drifted toward future plans, children, career moves, travel dreams. When Jason mentioned kids, my chest tightened for a second. Not from fear, but from anticipation. "Whenever that happens," I said calmly, "I want to be part of it, not as the one paying for everything, not as the decision maker, just as grandpa." Emily's eyes softened immediately. "You will be," she said, without hesitation. That assurance mattered more than any financial agreement ever could. As the evening slowed and guests prepared to leave, Emily pulled me aside once more. "Dad," she began, her voice quieter now, "I've been thinking about something." "What's on your mind?" "I realized that the rehearsal dinner hurt you more than I understood at the time." I nodded. "And I want you to know something important. If I ever make choices in the future that exclude you, it won't be because you don't belong. It will only be because I made a mistake." Her honesty was grounding. "And when that happens," she added softly, "I expect you to tell me." I smiled faintly. "You've given me permission?" "Yes." That simple exchange marked a new chapter between us. Not one built on fear of abandonment, not one built on financial leverage, but one on communication. After they left that night, I returned to the mantel and looked again at the framed wedding photo. I studied my expression carefully. I didn't look broken. I didn't look erased. I looked like a father who had given everything he could and then learned how to give differently. The $58,000 that once symbolized sacrifice now felt like part of a larger story. It had opened doors for reflection. It had exposed hidden expectations. It had forced conversations we might have avoided otherwise. Most importantly, it revealed something powerful. Love is not measured by how much we spend. It is measured by how willing we are to adapt when relationships evolve. I used to believe that protecting my place in my daughter's life required constant provision. Now I understand that my place is secured through presence, honesty, and boundaries. Emily is married now. She has her own home, her own partner, her own responsibilities. But she still calls me for advice. She still shares her fears. She still shows up at my door unannounced when life feels overwhelming. And I still show up for her, not with a checkbook in hand, but with steady support. If someone asked me today whether I regret paying for her wedding, I would answer the same way I did before. No, because that money wasn't just an expense, it was an investment in love. The difference now is that I understand investments require wisdom as well as generosity. And sometimes the most important return isn't financial, it's relational growth. The rehearsal dinner once felt like a door closing, but in truth, it became the moment that forced us to open conversations we had avoided for years. It taught me that letting go doesn't mean losing, and it taught Emily that independence doesn't require exclusion. We found our balance again, not as father and daughter tied by obligation, but as two adults choosing connection every day. And that choice, made freely, means far more than $58,000 ever could.